Caroline O'Donoghue's new novel for adults, The Rachel Incident, is a love story, but just not the one you might be expecting from the book's premise. Set in the post-economic crash Republic of Ireland of 2009, it sees our eponymous heroine looking for love and to be taken seriously, in a world now full of uncertainty. We sat down to talk about friendship, making memories, and cultural touchstones. Caroline, it's lovely to speak to you about The Rachel Incident. I'm going to say immediately that I found this to be a surprising novel. And what I mean by that is that I thought it was going to be one kind of book. And I was like, yeah, okay, I think I know where this is going. And I was almost immediately surprised by the sort of twist that the plot took. And I could imagine you as the author kind of going, you think you know where this is going, and it's not going there at all. Is that fair?
I think very fair and very joyful. And with all of my adult novels, I've really tried to do that. I think of like setting out your stall very early of being, this is the kind of novel you're getting. With Promising Young Women, it was very much pitched as a kind of a Bridget Jones sort of novel, and then it becomes a kind of gothic Daphne du Maurier type of thing, but set in an ad agency. And I really enjoy wrong-footing people, and with Scenes of Graphic Nature, it's sort of pitched as a buddy, whoa, what will we do about our friendship thing? And then it becomes a murder mystery. Whereas with The Rachel Incident, it very much sets its stall up at like as, this is one of those novels where an English professor sleeps with their student. When we have lots of those, and I love those novels. And there's a thing that Rachel, the main character and the narrator of the novel, says midway through, where she says, I have read dozens of books about what happens when English teachers have sex with their pupils and the terrible things that happen to them. I have read exactly 0 books about the terrible things that happen when your English teacher decides not to sleep with you. And that's kind of the crux of the whole book, I think.
I was going to say that for anybody who's worked in books, around books, or in a bookshop, there'll be lots that they immediately recognise, because Rachel works in a bookshop with her friend James, and that's kind of the setting for the setup of the novel. Certainly, I saw though that you had said that this was a book that you wrote. Or you said you pitched it in the genre of the author wrote this book in order to cheer themselves up during lockdown. But it's definitely a book that seems to be connected in what feel like very genuine memories of a particular place at a particular time, which in this case is sort of 2009 after the financial crash in Ireland, in Cork. Could you tell, is that true? I mean, is it very much based on sort of real memories for you? And then what was it about those that made you want to sort of sit down and turn those into a fiction?
It is, yes. It's funny, isn't it? We're this strange place with autobiography in fiction, where we all realize now it's very gauche to be like, oh, is this about you? Kind of thing. And we all get up on our high horses and be like, no, novelists invent things, and how dare you all? But then I don't want to. I think that we run a risk of discrediting fiction based on real life, and there is very much a lot of my real life put in here. When in 2009 and 10, I was living with my best friend, who at the time was closeted, and it was just the two of us in our own little world, and we worked in a HMV together. And what's nice about doing the Waterstones podcast is for a time HMV and Waterstones were sort of sister companies, and your discount would work in our shop, and our discount would work in your shop. So it felt very close to set it in a bookshop. So these are all of the plot and all those the characters are very much fictional people, but in terms of the moment of the time, this kind of economically depleted Ireland, where the city and the country is folding in on itself. It's emerging from this time of great sexual repression. At that point we didn't have gay marriage and we didn't have abortion access, but we did have the sexual mores of living in the modern world. You know what I mean? So it's like this weird crossroads, which I think produces many of the characters within this book, really. And I find that fascinating, that particular crossroads. And I think when you come to the question of like why choose this time to write about during lockdown, I feel like everybody during lockdown became extremely still. And the stillness allowed for memories to creep up on you in a very cinematic way. I don't know if it happened to you, Will, but like, would you just wake up in the middle of those months and suddenly be like, my best friend in school had a sister, and where is that sister now? You know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It was like, because there was no new events to process, all you could do was reprocess things. And my memories felt very real to me during that time. And so this became a wonderful place to process them.
It's really interesting because the first episode I recorded of the podcast this year was with Brett Easton Ellis, and he'd had exactly the same thing. It was
Mm,
during lockdown that he had started to have this very intimate connection to the memories of his. This was going right back to his schooling,
yes.
and that became, or sort of, allowed him to revisit something that he'd started to write, which became The Shards. And when you read that book, it's so visceral, that kind of connection
Yeah.
to something that's definitely real, but then has been taken in a totally different direction by creating the fiction. And your book too has this sort of, as I say, there are many ways in which it's surprising, because it feels like it's going to be a particular kind of book, and then there are these really big themes that underpin it, and also these really specific sort of moments. I don't know, there's sort of the descriptions of like Rachel's inability to sort of do something simple like laundry, so that she always smells slightly musty because the clothes haven't dried properly, and living in a flat that's filled with sort of that kind of damp and all that sort of stuff.
Yes,
I just
the
like, I could
vapor of
absolutely,
poverty. Yes.
yeah. I could sort of feel it and taste it and smell it and all the rest of it, and which I loved. And you've touched on there, as like I say, a couple of the really really big themes that come from that time period of sort of the financial crash. And one of those that's interesting, I think, for Rachel as a character is this idea that if the world appears to be sort of falling apart, and what's the hope in terms of your trajectory in life? Like, what's the career you're supposed to have if there is no such
Mm.
thing as a career anymore, or all the financial institutions are collapsing and stuff like that? That must be quite an interesting thing to sort of approach in fiction, because it's slightly not underpinned. It's sort of, it can feel, it could be a bit weightless. How do you sort of make that work as a theme in a book?
Well, just before I answer, I want to say that I loved your interview with Brett. I thought it was fantastic because
Oh, thank you.
because off the back of this book, I'm sort of writing, doing the thing of writing essays for various places in the whole,
Yeah.
like, here's my long thesis, buy my book. But I was reading Lunar Park, which is his campus novel of the
Yeah.
professor trying to shag their students. And then I listened to your episodes, and I thought it was fabulous, and I really related to him. I never thought I'd relate to Brett Easton Ellis on any level,
No.
but I really
Yeah.
related to that thing that he said about the stillness kind of giving memory a moment to flourish.
Yeah.
And yeah, but in sorry, I forgot your question. um,
I was just
the
saying that that's sort of one of the first big things, I suppose, is this idea, which is a slightly millennial thing, which is, I think, that for young people growing up in a time where the sort of natural progression of life, which would be like get a job, have a career, get married,
yes,
have kids, and all the rest of it. Once those things start to be chipped away at by things like the financial crisis, whatever it might
yeah.
be, it creates this really weird atmosphere for a character to be thinking, what do I do with my life? And
Yes.
that's where Rachel is.
Yes, and do you know what I love about that as well is that, like, millennials are now very much of age to
Mm.
be reflecting on that period of their lives. I think because it was, I mean, I hope, I think that every generation has its own particular struggles, obviously, and the Gen Z now, I look forward to in 10 years when they write about entering the workplace at this moment, where many of them have, not had the social aspect built in because they're having meetings on Zoom with clients, and they're not learning the little mores that you have to learn to be in offices. And I'm fascinated by that gap in knowledge. And when you enter the workplace, you would have had your own specific generation thing. And for me, it was very much this thing of trying to enter the workplace post recession, particularly because, like Rachel, I immigrated in 2011 when I was 21, and I had no experience, and also realized the experience that I did have counted for nothing because I was an Irish person in England. And
Right.
and like I love English people. I'm marrying one, but on the whole, unless you went to Trinity College Dublin, your life doesn't really exist. The fact that you wrote for the
Mm.
local paper doesn't really exist. It all feels like a mist and a vapor, and not really observed. And people have often asked me again and again at book events or whatever, what advice would you give to young writers or whatever, or aspiring writers? And I always think the same thing, and I never say it out loud because it's not nice, but it's like, compared to getting an entry-level marketing job in 2011, getting a book published was fucking easy. Like, I'm not saying it was easy, period. Like, it was, writing a book was hard, but like, I'll never forget that sort of year and a half period first living in London of being unable to get steady work during that climate, having impossible to get experience, impossible to get paid experience doing anything. And it left a huge mark on me, and like, I'm fascinated about writing about it, and I'm glad that enough time has passed now to be able to write about it with so that now that 2010 we can officially constitute it as a time period, as like a period where you can set something, and as opposed to something that feels very contemporary.
Yeah. There's a great phrase that Rachel uses in the book where she says, "I was 20 and I needed two things: to be in love and to be taken seriously." And I think that's something a lot of 20-year-olds can probably relate to. And I suppose the job aspect would be the sort of taken seriously. And to be in love is a really interesting thing, because in this book we follow her relationships, if you like, with two different Jameses, her best friend and a boyfriend, and those relationships are so brilliantly depicted. I think I want to talk about her relationship with James Devlin first, her best friend, because it's so beautifully rendered, and there's something very specific about the relationship between a woman and, in this case, her closeted gay best friend. And there's something about, I suppose, the kind of emotional honesty that comes from that relationship that might not exist with, let's say, more heterosexual men who might struggle talking about emotional things. The support they give each other, but also there's this slight lack of definition in the relationship, which I really liked, and that you develop later in the book. And again, you've mentioned that you were living with your own best friend at this time, and so it's very much rooted in that friendship, is it? And then how do you develop that again into the fiction?
Yeah, so James Devlin was originally, he's very unlike actually the person he's inspired by, which is my friend Ryan, and who, when I was writing this book, it was during that time where the only way you could see somebody is if you went for a walk with them or a cycle with them or whatever. And Ryan lives in London now, so we did a lot of that. And he's one of these people, and this was true even back when we were working in HMV together, where if somebody said, of all the 30 people who are working in this HMV, who's going to be famous? And it would definitely be Ryan, because he has this thing about him that I've always wanted to trap in words, and I've always just sat him down. I go, tell me, when you were on the run with your mom in 1998, and blah blah blah, and all this kind of. He has this incredible sort of life story that would sort of mimic, Frank McCourt, but like also just the funniest person you've ever met. And so the urge, and I always just felt like I was following him around a bit, really, a bit of a puppy, and sort of never really understood why somebody so brilliant would want to be friends with me, and that still sort of maintains, honestly. But creating that friendship, I think there's something very specific to the cultural framework of the straight woman and the gay man kind of thing. It's a relationship that we've seen a lot in culture. Going back from, I was thinking about The Sound of Music actually this morning, about how, there's a framework where you could understand The Sound of Music as being a movie about a wealthy aristocrat who has her fiance stolen from her from a singing nun, and who handles the whole thing very classily. And that character, Baroness von Schrader, who everybody remembers and everybody loves, the only time she ever tells anyone what she's thinking is her best friend Max, Uncle Max. He's nobody's brother, and he's a talent agent who loves nice things and saying funny things. And in the framework of a 1930s story in a 1960s musical, that means he's a gay man. And there's this bit where, like, she's doing this impossible game of trying to be the woman that Captain Von Trapp fell in love with, which is this Viennese aristocrat with a bunch of money and fabulousness all around her, and also this kind of impossible thing of being a maternal figure to these 7 children who she doesn't know. And it's a Sisyphean task, is she can't do it, but the only person she can turn to is like, is Max? And she's like, I have a feeling I'm being auditioned here. I don't know. And he's like, you're fine, don't worry. And every time I see that scene, I'm like, oh, that's it. That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's like, when you're a woman, you have to present so many faces to the world, and you have to do this high wire act so that men approve of you and other women don't hate you and all this. But there's something that is without stakes with other gay men, where you can just sort of hold each other's lives and fantasies with each other, because they also have to put a face to the world, that whether they're closeted or not, or whether they just have to always appear to be, yes, I'm gay, but I'm not that kind of gay, or whatever. There's a space where honesty can mix with fantasy that I think is very particular to the specifics of that relationship, and it's why I wanted to focus on it so much for this book.
It's so interesting because there are a lot of aspects to it, and without wanting to give away too much of the plot of the book, there are, let's just say, there are ways in which their friendship is challenged by what's going on, but there are also ways in which their friendship sort of rises above that it always manages to sort of survive. And the strength of their friendship also means, of course, that when Rachel meets the other James, Carey, who becomes her boyfriend, I suppose the deficiencies in that relationship exist because she has this other person that she can lean on for the other things. And so he's not a great boyfriend, but it's because she gets the other nourishment, I suppose, that she needs from the other James. That's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it? With the three of them together.
Yeah, I really love the dynamic. So when we meet James Carey, the first conversation, she meets him in how everybody meets everybody when they're 20, which is in the smoking area after kick out time, and bums a cigarette off him or whatever, and she says, what's your name? She says, what's your name? He says, James, and she says, well, I already have one of those, and that's the stall set up for their entire relationship. And then she only refers to him by his last name, which is Carey. And I think every woman has had a man in her life who she only referred to as his last name, and that is generally where the great heartbreak lies. Anyway, so they carry on, and the entire thing of Carey is that, like, he just kind of can't get it together. Like, if he was a man in 2023, he'd probably be taken to a therapist by a girlfriend and given ADHD medication. But like, it's 2009, so no one's on that yet. And he just kind of, I'd love to know what your impressions of him are as a man. But from my point of view, it's very much like, because he's unreliable and quite scatty, she is convinced that it means he doesn't care about her. But actually, his unreliability and his scattiness is bolstered by the fact he doesn't really feel needed, because she gets all of her emotional needs from somewhere else. And it's like, I do think that in all relationships, people only rise to the level of the bar that you set for them. And if you have no emotional needs, they will not meet them,
Yeah.
So what did you think of him as a man?
Well, I found it really interesting because, as you say, it would depend on your perspective to how you might read him as a character. And that, as you say, he's unreliable, but there was something about the honesty of their relationship. So I think that thing when they first get together, and I think they're having sex in the kitchen, and Carey's like, Jesus Christ, like he's quite overwhelmed by the intensity of her passion for him, which I thought was wonderfully honest and sort of fed a bit into their relationship, which is that he knows that she's always there and available to him, but they're sort of, I think her friendship with James Devlin means, as you say, that it's never going to be just her and Carey, because she's got this other really important relationship. And that means, in a way, that her relationship with Carey is not doomed to failure, but it's, as you say, it's never going to be that kind of like full on, it's the two of us against the world kind of thing, because that's just not the dynamic from the outset. And he sort of knows that. I just thought I think it's a very honest depiction of a relationship where there's kind of a third leg to it. And I think that that's quite an interesting dynamic to see played out in a fiction. We know about love stories and we know about terrible relationships, but this is neither of those things really. It's a good relationship that has some sort of things that could be improved. But of course, as you say, they're not improved because she gets it from elsewhere. She gets that sort of friendship or support or whatever you might want to call it from the other James in her life. You sort of want them to be able to live together happily somewhere, but it's tricky.
Yeah. And I what I like as well is that we only really get that perspective later on in the novel. And I like the idea because we're in Rachel's head and we're in Rachel's memories, that like the reader feels like they live in the house with James too, and it's like we're all having fun together,
Yeah.
and then you kind of zoom out and you kind of see it from Carrie's perspective and you realize how annoying it must be, like to hang out with two people who like convince they're Jimmy Stewart and Ava Gardner. Do you know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
and like I don't want to be the guest on your talk show. I want to be on my own show. You know?
Yeah. No, that's very, very true. There was this sort of plays into this idea of memory, as you say. I wrote down a quote because I thought it was really interesting. It's a bit long. I'm not sure if I'll read. I'll see if I can summarize. But it's to do with Rachel having this thing of she has a really great evening, and she talks about when you're that age and when something really good happens that you don't want to settle for the idea that that's just a one-off. You want to think that it's just the beginning of a non-stop sort of series of great things that are going to happen. In other words, that your sort of life takes off and it's just great. And that felt to me like a brilliant depiction of remembering those clear moments, like you say, when you in the quiet of lockdown, when you suddenly go, oh my god, like I suddenly remember that. I saw you'd shared recently as well some photographs. It was sort of like, that sort of aesthetic thing you see on Instagram.
Yes,
People are like,
yes. Me trying to
this is my
painstakingly
novel
be
in
relevant.
photographs.
Yes.
Yeah, seeing those pictures, I could sort of imagine how each of those must have connected to a very specific time in your life. I'm about 10 years ahead of you, so for me it was like 1997, and I remember that so clearly, like the music and the culture and what I was doing and how awfully I was behaving and all the rest of it, and what a great time that was. But it's a funny thing, isn't it, Memory? And that idea that you want that to be the first of many great things, but of course it's not necessarily that.
Yeah. You want everything good that happens to you to be the first day of the rest of your life, like
Mm,
yeah. I think we've all have those moments where, particularly in your youth, the first time that you stay up all night and watch the sunrise with somebody sitting on the roof of somewhere, and you're
mm.
like, wow, we should do this all the time. And those memories are actually, yeah, you might have gone to a lot of parties, but that moment where you felt really alive in your youth are so, they're lovely, but they're also, maybe this is speaking to my personal kinds of anxieties, but like they're always edged with a sense of like, well, what if this, I need to staple it to the floor somehow, and it has to be more than this.
Mm.
But I even feel like I'm still like that. Like every time I take up a new hobby, I'm like, this is me forever now. Like
Yeah.
I'm someone who plays tennis twice a week every week, and now I haven't picked up the racket in about 7 months. So
Did you pick up any hobbies during lockdown? Of course, like because we all had that time where we had to sort of fill the days with something. Is there anything that you started doing then
oh
that you've managed to
yeah.
maintain?
Oh yeah, there was the tennis for one. There was the horse riding became another one. I think I just have this idea in my head that one day I'll be invited to a terrific country house, and I can
I was going to
say,
say these are some quite high class hobbies you've managed
I
to
know
pick
I'm
up.
trying to do some class transition via my pastimes. And I read a lot of those books during lockdown where it's like indoors books where it's generally about like English country people in a house for a weekend and whatever. And there's always a character who can't play and she can't ride, and everyone hates her. And I was like, well, I
Yeah,
won't be them.
yeah, exactly. I'm not going to make that mistake.
Yeah, you gotta know how to play and you gotta know how to ride. Otherwise, you have to stay behind and get murdered.
Yeah, you just need to add sort of shooting or something, and you can probably do the modern heptathlon or
Yeah.
something. Um, the other thing I wanted to sort of mention was this thing of we're looking back at a time in Ireland which is actually less than 15 years ago, but culturally feels like there's been so much change
Yeah.
in that time. And as you mentioned, you're writing about a time when there was no gay marriage, and we're talking. You just sort of discuss in the book as well that sort of access to abortion and how different it was then to how it is now.
Mm.
How do you feel now? Sort of, I think looking back at Ireland, does it feel like a sort of a completely different era?
It's really strange. Yeah, I remember very clearly, a very formative early memory of mine was that I was during 2011 when I was trying so desperately to be employed in this country and finding it really difficult. I remember I was sitting in a greasy spoon and there was a radio by myself, and there was a radio thing about the death of a woman called Salvita
Uh-huh.
who is a very famous story in Ireland. Basically, this woman who who was allowed to die in labor because she was not given termination. And it became like a really global galvanizing story. You know, sometimes just that one story just takes something over the edge from a complaint to a real movement. Not that it wasn't a movement already, but, and I remember feeling in the Greasy Spoon in Elephant and Castle, like I was like sinking into my seat because I felt so ashamed that like I was from somewhere that was like this. And I had several of those moments in my early, you know, years in this country. Like I remember I had an ex-boyfriend who, I was at some family barbecue of his, and he had some like awful neighbor who was talking about the Irish recession and about how, I'll never forget this. He said, if you'll give a child a credit card, they will buy sweets. Which was like, I was such a, like, wow, what a xenophobia is happening to me. Wow. It was almost exciting. But then to have that change in really quite a short time into now, I feel like every time Irishness is almost like, imagine Sweden, but more of a laugh. Like, you know, like people are like, wow, you guys, you have all your authors and all these great actors and all these great TV shows. And it's so liberal, and there's these really well-funded arts programs, and you have abortion and gay marriage. Wow! And everyone wants a passport because of Brexit. So everyone's like congratulating my English husband to be because he gets to get his, you know, his passport or whatever eventually. And it's like it's changed so quickly, and it's such a radical shift in self perspective. Do you know what I mean? And like I imagine English people have this all the time, where they're like, we're so proud of our achievements, we're so ashamed of our achievements. You know. And I do think the longer I'm away from Ireland, the more I obsess over it, I think. And the more I think I'm in that great Irish cliche of someone who hasn't lived in the country for 15 years but writes about it ceaselessly. You know.
Yeah. I did some quick Googling because I was like, what was going on in 2009 culturally? Because, of course, on your own podcast, you go into some really deep dives into popular culture. And I was really pleased to see that 2009 was the year that Beyonce released Single Ladies. I wonder whether we should talk about the cultural significance of Single Ladies. I think only because I remember when that music video came out and everyone started doing the dance, it seemed like almost immediately there was the Saturday Night Live sketch where they were sort of taking the mickey out of that. And that video is almost as good as the music video, perhaps even better. How has that song managed to survive being mocked so relentlessly? And why does everybody know the dance?
So that's so funny. So do you know what? When I think of 2009, Single Ladies wasn't much of a thing for me personally. I don't know why, but what was a huge thing for me and for Ryan as well in that house share was Lady Gaga. And she was the first sort of shared contemporary obsession that we had. Like, this was still a time when Ryan was, you know, in the closet, but we were on like Lady Gaga fan sites. We joined Twitter to follow Lady Gaga. We would have countdowns to videos coming out, and like we would hold parties for the videos coming out. And we were just obsessed. And it like, yeah, that's what when I think of those times, I think of like, I think early noughties culture, pop culture was so insistently straight. Like it was so heterosexual. And I do sometimes think that is possibly a post 9/11 thing. I think that it was a post in wartime, gender dynamics are more ruthlessly upheld than ever. So we had this weird pink Barbie culture, raunch culture, Playboy bunny, sort of phone charms, Paris Hilton as an idol for young girls. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had like Call of Duty and like hyper masculinity, and like gaming becomes more aggressively masculine than it ever has been before, and more violent than ever before. And fashion becomes more feminine than ever before. And then I think when Lady Gaga came along, it felt like the first time in a long time that gay culture was being explicit, and blurring of gender became explicit, and weirdness was explicit. And for us, that was a really alive time.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, Lady Gaga is like the perfect.
Yeah, we needed her so badly.
Yeah, for that, but particularly for that, I think for that relationship, you said the relationship between the straight woman and the gay man.
Yeah.
Of course, they both love Lady Gaga.
Yeah,
that's just the perfect person.
Yeah, I remember we went to her concert. She was small enough at that point where she was playing Cork. You know, we went to see her in Cork. And I got so excited during Poker Face that I passed out, and Ryan had to drag me through the crowd out. And that's the whole relationship.
Yeah, I'm going to say that is our relationship in a nutshell.
Yeah.
It's not a metaphor; it actually happens. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
See, that's so much better than the other cultural touchstone that we could have gone to, which was Susan Boyle, which I don't think offers such riches.
I think about Susan Boyle so frequently, and I think this might be a bit too explicit for the Waterstones podcast, so cut it out if you don't like it. But do you remember on Twitter they tried to get Susan Boyle's album trending?
Her album party. This is. I think about it constantly because, of course, my life is social media.
Yeah.
So we have a mantra which is like always check the hashtag.
Yeah.
Like read it out. Make sure it doesn't say anal bum party as happened to poor old Susan Boyle.
I think like if like my entire sense of humor could be like boiled down to one thing, it would be Sue's anal bum party.
Yeah. I mean, we all remember the moment when we thought we were missing out because we hadn't been invited to Sue's anal fun party. Yeah, I honestly, it gives me. I get the fear about hashtags and stuff like that all the time, and I always, Susan Boyle is my constant.
Yeah,
reminder.
Best to go with just hashtag books.
Just keep
it safe.
Yeah. Don't try and get clever, otherwise you'll be in the same position as Susan Boyle. I feel we could disappear down a wormhole of 2009 reminiscences now, Callum. But I think I'm gonna wrap things up because it's just been such a delight to speak to you about the Rachel incident. As I said, a book that surprised me with so many things. The sort of the themes that you explored and the sort of the specificity of the relationships is so well done. So thank you so much for it. And
thanks, Will.
Great to speak to you about it today.
Great, thank you.
The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue is out now.